February 1945 was not a month of hope, but a month of sheer exhaustion. As the Third Reich crumbled under the weight of its own sins, the Western Front was bogged down in the cold, clinging mud of the Rhineland. The city of Trier, that ancient Roman guardian of Germany, stood as an insurmountable obstacle on the maps of the Allied Supreme Command in Paris. There, in warm, oak-paneled offices, generals measured kilometers and counted divisions, predicting weeks of bloody urban warfare just to reach the city's outskirts. But George S. Patton Jr. was not a man who believed in calendars or bureaucratic projections. To him, every minute spent planning was a minute the enemy could use to fortify their defense. He didn't look at Trier as a fortress, but as a door that needed to be kicked in before anyone could say stop. His Third Army didn't just march, it devoured the road ahead, driven by the will of a man who believed his destiny was written in the stars and gunpowder. War is not only won on the battlefield, but also in the corridors of power, and Patton fought a personal crusade on both fronts. His command style was anathema to pedantic planners like Omar Bradley or Dwight Eisenhower. While they sought logistical perfection and safety in numbers, Patton believed in what he called violent reconnaissance: hit fast, hit hard, and never let the enemy realize how vulnerable you actually are. In the headquarters, it was whispered that he was dangerous, egotistical, and untamable, a machine that knew no breaks. But in the foxholes, the soldiers knew the truth. Patton's audacity was their best chance of coming home alive. Trier became the symbol of this conflict. On one side, the cautious generals demanding 4 divisions for the assault, and on the other, a lone cowboy with ivory-handled revolvers, who already smelled victory in the air. The technology of war in 1945 was slow, tethered by wires that constantly snapped and radio links lost in snowstorms. By the time the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, finally reached the decision that Trier should be bypassed or wait for massive reinforcements, the dispatch began its journey. It was an order based on old data, on the fear of losses that could slow down the entire front line. The message was clear: Trier is too big a mouthful for your current forces. Do not enter the city without 4 full divisions. I repeat, do not enter. That paper, cold and sterile, traveled through the chain of command while the engines of Patton's tanks were already igniting the frigid morning air. It was a supreme irony of history that the order to stop arrived only when it was too late for anything but triumph or total catastrophe. Imagine the sound of steel scraping across frozen earth and the smell of diesel mixing with the scent of burning wood. The 10th Armored Division, under Patton's relentless pressure, began its breakthrough without air support, without backup plans, and without enough fuel. It was a gamble of epic proportions. Soldiers sat on their tanks, faces covered in soot, knowing that no one was coming up behind them. Patton pushed them beyond the limits of human endurance, not because he was cruel, but because he knew that speed replaces the thousands of soldiers the generals in the rear were withholding. Every village they passed, every German ambush they shattered, was a step closer to Trier. This wasn't a war from a textbook. It was a charge of desperate men led by a genius who refused to accept the word impossible as a legitimate answer to his demands. When the first Sherman tanks breached the outer defensive lines of Trier, the city looked like a ghost from another era. The ancient Porta Nigra, gates that had stood for thousands of years, now witnessed the passage of a new kind of empire. The German defenders, exhausted and confused by the lack of clear orders from Berlin, put up a resistance that was more an act of defiance than strategic defense. The streets of Trier became a labyrinth of smoke and rubble. Patton wasn't with the lead tanks, but his presence was palpable in every bullet fired. As white flags began to appear in the windows of civilian houses, the city that was supposed to swallow 4 divisions fell to the fury of just 2. It was a moment of total silence after the storm, the moment Patton proved that the maps in Paris were just paper and war was a matter of sheer will. In a makeshift headquarters, amidst the ash and dust of the newly captured city, a telegraph operator sat with a note handwritten by Patton. This was no official report full of military jargon and coordinates. It was a message sent directly into the heart of the military bureaucracy, a message that would forever define Patton's character in the history books. Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. The opening read, almost nonchalantly, as if it were a casual stroll. But the follow-up to that message was the one that caused disbelief in General Bradley's headquarters. "Do you want me to give it back?" In those 8 words was summarized all of Patton's resentment toward those who doubted him, all his contempt for caution, and all his triumph over a system that tried to leash him. It was the most expensive sarcasm in the history of warfare. When the message reached Omar Bradley, there was a stunned silence. The generals looked at each other, not knowing whether to court-martial Patton for disobedience or award him another medal. Bradley, the man they called the GI's general for his care for his men, was furious. Patton had risked everything, an entire division, the stability of the entire front, just to prove he was right. But as he looked at the map and saw that the blue arrow now stood firmly in the center of Trier, Bradley had to admit defeat to Patton's genius. He couldn't order a retreat. The city was in their hands. Patton had presented them all with a fait accompli. That ultimatum wasn't just a joke. It was a reminder that wars aren't won with caution, but with the kind of madness that only winners can justify. But every victory has its dark side, the one that maps don't show. Although Trier fell with fewer troops than predicted, the fields around the city were sown with the bodies of young men who would never see the end of the war. Patton's speed was surgical, but the cuts were deep. As he walked the streets of the city, the general saw the faces of the civilians, those who looked at him with hatred, and those who looked at him with relief because hell was finally over. In that moment, Trier wasn't just a strategic point. It was a laboratory of human nature. Patton knew that this triumph would be forgotten if he didn't keep moving, if he didn't keep pushing until the entire Reich collapsed. To him, Trier wasn't the end of the road, but only proof that all obstacles, whether German or Allied, were merely illusions that a brave man could shatter. While the soldiers rested in the shadows of ancient Roman walls, Patton was already looking toward the east. He saw what others didn't yet want to admit, that the fall of Berlin wouldn't bring eternal peace, but only a new kind of conflict. His ultimatum at Trier was the first act of a drama that would span decades. He believed that America must not stop, that the enemy must be completely destroyed before a new one could emerge. His aggressiveness in Trier was a message to the Russians as well, who were surging from the east with equal force. On those maps, the stains of coffee and blood marked the beginning of a new era where borders would be drawn the way Patton drew his attacks, fast, bold, and regardless of the cost. Trier was just the first step in a world that Patton understood better than anyone else. George S. Patton Jr. was never built for peacetime. His spirit, forged in fire and steel, required constant conflict, a constant validation of his greatness. Trier remains recorded as his purest moment, the moment when one man, opposed by both the enemy and his own allies, turned the tide of history by his will alone. When the lights on the front were finally extinguished, and he passed away from a mundane car accident just months after the victory, the world breathed a sigh of relief, but also felt the loss. There was no one left to send a dispatch saying, "Do you want me to give it back?" His maps have faded now, and the cities he captured have been rebuilt, but the legend of old blood and guts and his defiance at Trier lives on as a reminder of a time when war was a matter of character, and victory was reserved only for those who had the courage to be disobedient.